June 552 AD, an elderly Roman general with 18,000 men faced the entire Gothic nation in arms. 75,000 Gothic warriors, every able-bodied man their kingdom could muster, stood between Narses and the reconquest of Italy. By sunset, the Gothic kingdom would cease to exist. Not defeated, annihilated. Think about those numbers. 18,000 against 75,000. The Goths had a 4-to-1 advantage and were fighting for their homeland. Yet by the end of this story, you'll understand how a 74-year-old eunuch achieved what Rome's greatest generals had failed to do for 20 years. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will shatter how you see Byzantine warfare forever. First, the crescent formation that turned Gothic cavalry into their own executioners. Second, why 8,000 Goths died in the first 17 minutes without touching a single Roman. And third, the psychological warfare tactic that made an entire nation lose the will to fight. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did Narses cross the Alps, with the Goths blocking every pass? Why did Gothic heavy cavalry, the most feared warriors in Europe, charge straight into a killing zone they could clearly see? How did dismounted archers stop the greatest cavalry charge in Gothic history? To understand how 18,000 men destroyed a kingdom, we need to step back to when Italy itself was bleeding to death. Italy was dying, and Rome had run out of generals who could save it. For 20 years, the Gothic War had consumed the peninsula like slow fire, turning the breadbasket of the ancient world into a graveyard. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years lay empty. Aqueducts crumbled, fields turned to wilderness. And in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian faced a choice that would determine whether the Roman Empire died with dignity or crawled back from the abyss. He chose a 4-year-old eunuch who had never commanded an army in battle. Let those numbers sink in. 20 years of continuous warfare. Italy's population had crashed from 5 million to barely 2 million. The peninsula that once fed the empire now imported grain just to prevent starvation. Justinian had already spent the equivalent of 18,000 pounds of gold, enough to build 50 Hagia Sophias, and had nothing to show but ashes and mass graves. Belisarius, Rome's legendary general, had tried first. The man who'd reconquered North Africa and smashed the Vandal kingdom arrived in Italy in 535 with 7,500 men. He took Rome, then Naples, then Ravenna itself. Victory seemed certain. But the Goths learned, adapted. By 541, they'd reclaimed everything under a new king named Totila. Belisarius returned in 544, failed again, and limped back to Constantinople, a broken man. Rome's greatest living general couldn't end this war. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Justinian had one commander left, a man who'd never held military rank, never commanded a cohort, never even ridden in a cavalry charge. Narses had spent 5 decades as imperial treasurer and chief of staff. He balanced budgets. He managed palace politics. He organized logistics, while other men earned glory. The Senate thought Justinian had gone mad, a eunuch, against Gothic warriors who'd been fighting since they could walk. But Justinian saw what others missed. Narses had supplied every Roman campaign for 30 years. He knew exactly how many horseshoes an army needed per mile. He understood that wars weren't won by brave charges, but by beans and arrows arriving on schedule. While Belisarius chased glory, Narses had been quietly studying every Gothic battle, every defeat, every Roman mistake. He'd built a mental map of Italian geography more detailed than any general possessed. And he had one advantage no Roman commander had enjoyed in decades. Justinian gave him everything he asked for. In January 552, Narses requested 18,000 men and specified exactly which units. The empire's last gamble walked out of Constantinople's gates in March 552, a slight elderly man in plain robes who looked more like a merchant than Rome's final hope. Behind him marched 18,000 soldiers who would either save the empire or watch it die. What none of them knew, Narses had already planned the entire campaign in his head, down to the exact valley where the Gothic kingdom would cease to exist. Narses wasn't supposed to be a general. Born in Armenia, castrated as a boy, he'd spent 50 years managing imperial finances and palace intrigue. But Justinian saw something others missed, a mind that treated war like mathematics and soldiers like chess pieces. When Belisarius, Rome's legendary general, failed to end the Gothic War, Justinian made a bet that seemed insane. He gave total command to a man who'd never led troops in combat. What happened next would justify that impossible faith. Here's what made Narses different from every Roman general before him. While others studied Caesar's campaigns and Alexander's tactics, Narses studied supply chains and logistics tables. He knew that an army of 18,000 men required 12,000 pounds of grain per day. That cavalry horses needed 4 gallons of water each in summer heat. That Gothic warriors could march 25 miles daily, but their supply wagons could only manage 12. Most generals saw warfare as a series of glorious battles. Narses saw it as a math problem, where whoever calculated better won. The Byzantine court mocked him openly. Senator Marcellus called it sending an accountant to do a soldier's work. General John, who'd served under Belisarius, refused to acknowledge Narses' authority until Justinian threatened execution. Even Narses' own officers whispered doubts. 74 years old, no combat experience, a eunuch commanding men who'd spent their lives training for war. The betting pools in Constantinople gave him 6 months before Totila sent his head back in a basket. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. Narses spent his first 3 weeks in command doing something no Roman general had ever done. He interviewed every soldier who'd fought in Italy, not the officers, the soldiers. He spoke to Herulian cavalry about Gothic charge patterns. He questioned Armenian archers about effective killing range against armored horsemen. He grilled Lombard infantry about mountain passes the Goths considered impassable. While other generals relied on maps and reports, Narses built a tactical database in his mind from 3,000 individual conversations. Then came the decision that proved his genius. Traditional Roman strategy called for landing at Ravenna, taking the coastal cities, then pushing inland. Predictable, slow, exactly what the Goths expected. Narses studied the intelligence and made a calculation that shocked his staff. He would cross the Alps in early summer, approach Italy from the north, where no Roman army had come in 50 years, and force march to Rome before Totila could react. His logistics officer protested it was impossible. The passes were too narrow, Gothic scouts too numerous, supply lines would stretch too thin. Narses pulled out a document he'd been preparing for 6 months. It detailed every mountain pass between Dalmatia and Italy, listed Gothic patrol schedules based on refugee reports, calculated precise march rates for different terrain types, specified exactly where supply depots must be positioned every 30 miles. The document ran to 73 pages of meticulous planning. His officers stared in silence. This wasn't military genius, this was something stranger and more terrifying. Perfect mathematical certainty. In April 552, Narses marched his 18,000 men toward the Alps. He carried no siege equipment, minimal baggage, and supplies calculated to last exactly 47 days. Either he would reach Rome by then, or the entire army would starve in the mountains. The bureaucrat had just bet everything on numbers, logistics, and a rout the Goths swore was sealed. What Totila didn't know, his kingdom's destruction was already written in Narses' ledgers. Because while the Gothic king was mobilizing 75,000 warriors for the decisive battle that would save his kingdom, a 7-4-year old accountant was about to do something no one thought possible. Cross the Alps through a route so treacherous it didn't even have a name on Roman maps. King Totila had done the impossible. He'd united every Gothic clan, called in every favor, emptied every village of fighting men. By spring 552, he commanded the largest Gothic army ever assembled, 75,000 warriors. From grizzled veterans who'd fought Belisarius to boys barely old enough to lift a spear, they gathered near Rome with one purpose: destroy Narses before he could bring Rome's vengeance to Italy. The Gothic kingdom would stake everything on a single battle. They had no idea they were marching toward their extinction. Think about what 75,000 warriors meant in 552. The entire Gothic population in Italy numbered perhaps 200,000. Totila had mobilized every third person. Every farm lost its workers. Every village lost its defenders. Every family sent fathers and sons, knowing many wouldn't return. This wasn't just an army, it was the Gothic nation in arms, betting its entire future on one decisive clash. The numbers defied belief. 8,000 heavy cavalry, Gothic nobles in iron scale armor, riding massive war horses bred for shock charges. These weren't light raiders, but the elite of Gothic society. Warriors who trained since childhood. Men whose families had ruled Italy for 3 generations. Behind them marched 67,000 infantry. Some carried Roman weapons, looted from defeated legions. Others wielded traditional Gothic long swords and throwing axes, all burned with knowledge that defeat meant the end of everything they'd built. Here's what Gothic chronicles tried to hide. Totila knew this mobilization was destroying his kingdom. Fields went unplanted because farmers were marching to war. Tribute from subject cities dried up because Gothic garrisons had been stripped for the army. His treasury hemorrhaged gold, paying mercenaries and buying loyalty from wavering nobles. One Roman spy reported that Gothic silver coins were being mixed with copper to stretch remaining bullion. The kingdom was financially collapsing even before battle began. Totila had perhaps 6 months before internal revolt became inevitable. But Totila had confidence that defied mathematics. His scouts reported Narses commanded only 18,000 men, 75,000 against 18,000. That's a 4-1-7, 2-1 advantage. Better odds than any Gothic king had enjoyed against Rome in living memory. Gothic warriors who'd fought Belisarius to a standstill sneered at the idea of a bureaucrat eunuch matching their battlefield prowess. Victory seemed mathematically certain. In May 552, Totila's massive host began moving north from Rome. The column stretched 12 miles when fully deployed, dust clouds visible from 20 miles away. The sound of 75,000 men marching shook the ground like distant thunder. Italian peasants fled at reports of the army's approach, remembering 20 years of brutal warfare. This was the largest military force Italy had seen since the fall of the Western Empire, 76 years earlier. Totila rode at the head of his host, wearing armor inlaid with gold, his horse draped in purple silk, projecting the confidence of a king who'd never lost a major battle. Behind him, Gothic warriors sang battle songs, celebrating victories over Roman legions. They expected to meet Narses somewhere in central Italy, crush his inferior force, then spend summer mopping up remaining Roman garrisons. By autumn, Totila planned to be crowned in Ravenna as undisputed master of Italy. What they didn't know, Narses wasn't where they expected. While Gothic scouts searched the coastal roads, the Roman army was doing something impossible in the Alpine passes far to the north. The Goths were marching toward a battlefield Narses had already chosen, and the first challenge facing Rome's elderly general was one that should have been insurmountable: getting 18,000 men across mountains that nature itself had fortified better than any wall. The Alps should have been impassable. Totila's scouts held every pass, every valley, every route into Italy. Gothic cavalry patrolled the foothills. ready to massacre any Roman force that attempted the crossing. Narses studied the maps and found something historians still debate: a route so treacherous the Goths didn't bother guarding it. In early June, 18,000 Roman soldiers began a march that defied logic, leading pack horses up slopes meant for mountain goats, crossing snowfields in summer, descending into Italy where no one expected them. The route Narses chose had no name on Roman maps. Local shepherds called it the Serpent's Path, a track that wound through passes at elevations above 7,000 feet, where summer meant freezing nights, and where a single rock slide could bury an entire cohort. Gothic commanders had dismissed it as suicide. No army could move siege equipment through those defiles. Supply wagons would break their axles on the first switchback. Men and horses would freeze at night, even in June. Here's what made Narses's gamble genuinely insane. His intelligence network reported that Totila had positioned 3,000 cavalry to guard the 5 main Alpine passes: the Via Postumia, the Brenner Pass, the Great Street Bernard, all heavily patrolled. Any force attempting those routes would be spotted days before reaching Italy, giving Totila time to position his 75,000 warriors for ambush. But the Serpent's Path? Gothic scouts checked it once per month. They considered it impassable for anything larger than a shepherd's flock. Narses made his calculation. Lose perhaps 2,000 men to cold exhaustion and falls during the Alpine crossing, or lose the entire army in a mountain pass ambush. The mathematics favored the impossible route. On June 3rd, 552, the Roman army began climbing into terrain where empires feared to march. Think about what this meant logistically. 18,000 men require 12,000 pounds of food daily. In the Alps, there were no Roman supply depots, no friendly cities, no foraging. Everything had to be carried. Narses had calculated they needed supplies for 14 days to complete the crossing. That meant each pack horse they brought, 4,000, carried 168 pounds of grain, salted pork, and hardtack. The horses themselves needed fodder. The total supply column stretched 3 miles when moving through narrow defiles. The first 2 days went smoothly. Roman soldiers, many from mountain regions themselves, handled the steep grades better than expected. Herulian cavalry dismounted and led their horses by hand. Armenian archers, accustomed to high altitude, took vanguard positions. By June 5th, they'd climbed above the tree line, where nothing grew but moss and stunted grass. Then disaster struck. On the evening of June 6th, a freak summer snowstorm descended on the passes. Temperature dropped below freezing. Wind howled through the mountain corridors like screams of dying men. Narses' officers urged him to turn back. They were losing horses to exposure. Men were collapsing from hypothermia. The entire gamble was unraveling. The old eunuch refused. Turning back meant arriving in Italy after Totila had positioned his forces. Forward was the only direction that led to victory. For 3 days, 18,000 men endured conditions that killed 57 soldiers and 300 horses. They wrapped themselves in every spare cloth they carried. They huddled together at night, sharing body heat. They force-marched during daylight to generate warmth. And on June 9th, the storm broke. Through thinning clouds, Roman scouts spotted something that made them weep with relief. Below them, green and impossibly distant, lay the Po Valley. They'd crossed the Alps, where no army should have survived, and not a single Gothic scout had seen them coming. But now came the second impossible task: racing 280 miles to Rome before Totila's 75,000 warriors could block their path. Narses didn't march like a conqueror, he sprinted like a man fleeing death. Every hour mattered, because Totila was doing the same, force-marching his Gothic host toward Rome, hoping to trap Narses against the city's walls. 2 armies racing toward the same prize, neither willing to slow down. Narses covered distances that should have taken weeks in days. pushing his men until their feet bled, because he understood something fundamental. Whoever reached Rome first would choose the battlefield. And in medieval warfare, choosing the battlefield meant choosing who lived and who died. The mathematics of the race were brutal. Narses descended from the Alps on June 10th. Rome lay 280 miles south. Totila's army, camped near Ravenna, sat 190 miles northeast of Rome. The Goths had a 90-mile advantage. But here's where Narses' obsession with logistics became the deciding factor. Gothic armies moved at 15 miles per day, slowed by supply wagons and the sheer mass of 75,000 men. Narses had calculated his force could sustain 22 miles daily by abandoning everything except weapons and minimal rations. Let that sink in. 22 miles per day through June heat, in full armor, with inadequate food and water. Modern military experts consider 15 miles the maximum sustainable rate for pre-modern armies. Narses demanded his men exceed that by nearly 50%. For 12 consecutive days, his officers protested it would destroy the army through exhaustion before battle even began. Narses showed them his calculations. Arrive exhausted but alive, or arrive fresh and dead, because Totila had chosen the killing ground. By June 13th, Roman scouts reported Gothic columns moving south at forced pace. Totila had received word that a Roman army had somehow appeared in northern Italy. He didn't believe the numbers. At first 18,000 through the Alps? Impossible. But his scouts confirmed it. Now the Gothic king faced a nightmare scenario. If Narses reached Rome first and garrisoned the city, the war would drag on for years. Totila accelerated his march, pushing his massive host to its breaking point. Here's what chronicles don't tell you. Both armies began to disintegrate from the pace. Narses lost approximately 800 men in those 12 days, not to combat, but to collapsed exhaustion, heat stroke, and soldiers who simply couldn't maintain the speed. He left them behind with local villagers, taking only those who could keep moving. Totila suffered worse. His supply wagons broke down. His infantry straggled across 30 miles of road. His cavalry horses began dying from being ridden too hard in armor. On June 21st, Narses' vanguard reached the Via Flaminia, the great Roman road leading south to Rome. They were 70 miles from the city. Gothic scouts reported Totila was 85 miles away. Narses had won the race by a margin of 12 hours, but exhaustion had reduced his effective force to perhaps 16,000 combat-ready soldiers. Many could barely stand. All needed rest, water, and food before they could fight. Narses gave them 4 hours. Then he ordered the final sprint, 70 miles in 3 days. The men who couldn't keep pace would have to catch up after the battle, if there was an after. On June 24th at dawn, Roman scouts spotted something that changed everything. A valley called Taginae, nestled in the Apennine foothills 50 miles north of Rome. Narses studied the terrain and smiled for the first time in weeks. He'd found where the Gothic kingdom would die. Now he just needed to convince Totila to attack him there. The valley of Taginae sits in the Apennine foothills, a natural corridor between mountain ridges. Narses reached it first and immediately understood this was where the Gothic kingdom would end. Narrow enough that numbers mattered less, open enough for his archers to work, sloped enough that Gothic cavalry would tire charging uphill. He positioned his 18,000 men and waited, knowing Totila had no choice but to come to him. Geography had just become Rome's greatest ally. The valley measured approximately 2 miles wide at its broadest point, narrowing to 800 yards where Narses positioned his center. Mountain ridges rose steeply on both sides, too steep for cavalry charges, perfect for preventing flanking maneuvers. The slope from the valley floor to Narses' position climbed gradually at a 5-degree angle. Doesn't sound like much until you're a Gothic knight in 80 pounds of armor, riding a warhorse up that grade under arrow fire. Here's where Narses' mathematical mind saw what no traditional general would notice. At a 5-degree slope, over 600 yards, Gothic heavy cavalry would lose approximately 30% of their charging speed by the time they reached Roman lines. Their horses would be winded, their formations would loosen. Most critically, they'd be struggling uphill for the final 300 yards, exactly the range where Byzantine composite bows achieved maximum killing efficiency. Narses spent June 24th positioning his forces with obsessive precision. He measured distances by having soldiers pace them off. He calculated firing angles by having archers test shoot at different elevations. His officers thought he'd gone mad. The Gothic army was 12 hours away, and he was conducting geometry lessons. But every measurement mattered. At 300 yards, a Byzantine archer could penetrate Gothic scale armor. At 200 yards, the penetration became fatal. At 100 yards, arrows went through armor and the man behind it. Think about what this meant tactically. Traditional Roman doctrine called for infantry centers with cavalry wings, meet the enemy charge, hold the line, counterattack if possible. Narses was planning something different, something that had never been attempted in European warfare. He would use the valley itself as a weapon, channeling Gothic cavalry into killing zones where their numerical advantage became their death sentence. By evening on June 24th, Roman positions were set. Narses stood at the army's center, personally directing the placement of every unit. To his left, 4,000 Herulian cavalry under John the Glutton, the best cavalry commander in the Byzantine army. To his right, 5,000 Lombard infantry commanded by Valerian, veterans who'd fought in the Alpine passes. And here's the detail that would change military history: 8,000 archers, dismounted from their horses, positioned at precise angles on both flanks. Gothic scouts, observing from distant ridges, reported the Roman deployment to Totila. They noted the strange positioning, the archers on foot, the relatively weak-looking center. It appeared Narses had made a critical error spreading his forces too thin across the valley, creating gaps that Gothic cavalry could exploit. The scouts recommended immediate attack. What the Gothic scouts couldn't see from their distant vantage points were the angles, the precise, mathematically calculated firing positions that would turn their cavalry charge into a slaughter corridor. Narses had designed a trap disguised as a defensive line. On the morning of June 25th, 552 AD, Totila's 75,000 warriors arrived at Taginae's valley mouth. They saw 18,000 exhausted Romans positioned on a gentle slope. Victory seemed inevitable. The greatest military miscalculation in Gothic history was about to unfold. What Narses built at Taginae had never been attempted in European warfare. He arranged his army in a crescent shape. Cavalry on the wings pulled back. Infantry center pushed forward. And here's the genius: 8,000 dismounted archers on each flank, positioned at angles to create a killing corridor down the center. Any force charging the Roman center would be caught in converging fire from both sides. Gothic cavalry, used to smashing through infantry lines, would ride straight into a meat grinder. The formation looked strange to Roman veterans. By sunset, it would be copied for centuries. Let the numbers sink in. Traditional Roman battle lines stretched horizontally, a straight wall of shields and spears. Narses created a crescent approximately 1,200 yards wide at the wings, narrowing to 600 yards at the center. The archer positions formed 4-5-degree angles from the center line. Any cavalry charging straight ahead would receive fire from their left and right simultaneously, hitting unarmored sides and flanks where Gothic scale armor provided minimal protection. Here's what made this formation genuinely revolutionary. Byzantine archers typically fought on horseback, mobile, flexible, able to retreat from heavy cavalry. Narses ordered them to dismount, plant stakes in front of their positions, and fight as stationary platforms. His officers protested immediately. Dismounted archers couldn't retreat if Gothic cavalry broke through. They'd be slaughtered where they stood. Narses' response became legendary. "We're not here to retreat. We're here to kill everything that enters that valley." The tactical mathematics were precise and brutal. Each Byzantine archer carried 40 arrows in 2 quivers. At their positioned angle, they could achieve sustained fire of 6 arrows per minute, 1 arrow every 10 seconds. 8,000 archers per flank meant 16,000 total. That's 96,000 arrows per minute. 1,600 arrows every single second in the first 17 minutes of engagement before resupply became necessary. Think about what Gothic cavalry would face charging that formation. They'd gallop uphill toward what appeared to be a weak Roman center. At 400 yards, arrows would begin falling. At 300 yards, the killing started, arrows penetrating armor, dropping horses, creating obstacles. At 200 yards, the arrow density became literal steel rain. Gaps in formation disappeared as horses fell and riders piled up. Chaos replaced cohesion. And all of this happening while charging uphill, losing speed, horses tiring. But here's where it gets insane. Narses didn't just calculate the arrow mathematics. He calculated the psychological impact. Gothic warriors had faced Roman archers before, mobile horse archers who fired and retreated. They'd never faced stationary archers who stood their ground, shooting methodically, creating lanes of death that couldn't be avoided. The psychological difference between facing an enemy who might run and an enemy who absolutely won't is the difference between courage and terror. The center of Narses' formation, where Gothic cavalry would naturally target, consisted of his weakest infantry, Lombard foot soldiers, poorly armored, inexperienced against Gothic cavalry charges. From a distance, they looked like easy prey. Gothic commanders studying the Roman line would see that weak center and think, break through there, roll up the flanks, victory in 30 minutes. What they couldn't calculate, those Lombards didn't need to win. They just needed to not break immediately, hold formation for 5 minutes while 16,000 archers did the real work. 5 minutes of discipline equaled Gothic annihilation. As the sun climbed toward noon on June 25th, Narses stood at his center position, watching Gothic cavalry begin their deployment. Officers approached, asking for final orders. The old eunuch, 74 years old, who'd never commanded troops in battle before this campaign, gave instructions that violated every conventional warfare principle. Hold position, do not advance. Trust the formation. Across the valley, Gothic commanders saw the strange crescent formation and smiled. The Romans had made a fatal error, spreading their forces too thin, creating a weak center. This would be over quickly. In the next 4 hours, that confidence would transform into the greatest military disaster in Gothic history. Totila arrived with 75,000 warriors, expecting immediate battle. Narses gave him nothing. The old eunuch sat on his horse, watching, waiting, letting the June sun beat down on Gothic armor, while his own men rested in shade. Hours passed. Gothic warriors, pumped for combat, grew restless. Their horses, armored and ready, began to tire from standing in formation. Narses understood psychology. An army wound tight for battle, but denied release begins to unravel from within. The Gothic army reached Taginae's valley mouth at 9 a.m. By noon, they still hadn't attacked. Temperature climbed past 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Gothic heavy cavalry wore iron scale armor weighing 80 pounds. Their war horses carried another 60 pounds of horse armor, iron plates protecting chest, flanks, and head. In summer heat, standing idle in full armor becomes torture. Horses began to sweat profusely, losing the hydration and stamina they'd need for charging. Warriors removed helmets to breathe, then had to put them back on when scouts reported possible Roman movement. Here's what chronicles don't tell you. Narses had positioned his forces with deliberate calculation of sun angles. The Roman line faced northeast, meaning morning and afternoon sun hit them from behind or the side. The Goths, deployed facing southwest, stared directly into afternoon glare. Small detail, massive advantage. Gothic cavalry preparing to charge would be squinting into sun, making precise target acquisition nearly impossible. Roman archers would shoot with perfect visibility. By 1 p.m., Gothic commanders urged Totila to attack. The men were ready, the horses still relatively fresh. Momentum favored immediate assault. Totila refused. He was waiting for something reinforcements from a garrison he'd sent word to the previous day. 2,000 additional cavalry, who would arrive by mid-afternoon. The Gothic king, outnumbering Romans 4-1, delayed battle to achieve a 4-1-2-1 advantage. That caution would cost him everything. Narses, watching from his position, understood exactly what Totila was doing, and he exploited it ruthlessly. He ordered his men to perform elaborate drills, shifting formations, moving units, creating the impression of nervous activity. Roman cavalry trotted back and forth between wings. Infantry sections rotated positions. To Gothic observers, it looked like confusion, like Romans uncertain of their deployment. Actually, Narses was keeping his men active and loose, while Gothic warriors stood static and stiffening. Think about the physical toll. Gothic cavalry had been standing in formation, mostly motionless, for 5 hours. Their leg muscles cramped, their backs ached from armor weight. Their horses, bred for explosive charges, grew increasingly irritable from standing still. Meanwhile, Roman soldiers rotated through rest periods, drank water from pre-positioned supply points, and stayed loose through constant movement. At 3 p.m., Totila's reinforcements arrived 2,000 fresh cavalry that should have guaranteed victory. The Gothic king deployed them on his right wing, positioning his now 77,000 warriors for the assault he delayed all day. His commanders prepared for the signal. Victory seemed inevitable. 77,000 against perhaps 16,000 Romans who'd marched themselves nearly to death, reaching this valley. But here's where waiting turned from caution into catastrophe. Totila, perhaps sensing the day slipping away, perhaps feeling pressure from restless nobles, made a decision that would haunt Gothic survivors forever. Instead of sending his entire force forward in one overwhelming wave, he would demonstrate Gothic martial superiority through elite cavalry shock. He would lead 8,000 heavy cavalry, the Gothic nobility, the finest warriors in his kingdom, in a direct charge at the Roman center. Smash through, prove Gothic supremacy, then signal the infantry to finish the slaughter. It was classic Gothic tactics. It had worked for 3 generations. At 4 p.m. on June 25th, 552 AD, King Totila raised his sword and pointed it at the Roman line. 8,000 Gothic knights spurred their tired horses into a charge that would end their kingdom forever. At 4 p.m., 8,000 Gothic heavy cavalry began their charge. These weren't light raiders. These were noble warriors in full armor on massive war horses, the elite of Gothic society, veterans of 2 decades of war. The ground shook as they thundered uphill toward the Roman center. In traditional warfare, infantry would break before this iron avalanche. But Narses wasn't fighting traditionally. The decision made tactical sense based on everything Gothic commanders knew about warfare. Heavy cavalry charges had dominated European battlefields for 2 centuries. Gothic nobles in full armor, riding war horses bred for size and power, could shatter infantry formations through sheer kinetic force. They'd done it against Roman legions, against Frankish warbands, against Burgundian armies. Every major Gothic victory for 3 generations had begun with a successful cavalry charge. Here's what made Totila's decision seem brilliant to his commanders. The Roman center looked weak Lombard infantry, poorly armored, spread thin across 600 yards. 8,000 Gothic cavalry charging in wedge formation would hit that center with approximately 13,000 pounds of force per yard. Basic physics said the Lombard line would collapse. Once broken, Gothic cavalry would wheel left and right, rolling up the Roman flanks, while 67,000 Gothic infantry surged forward to finish the massacre. Think about the pressure Totila faced. His Gothic nobles, standing in armor under June's sun for 6 hours, demanded action. His infantry, watching from behind, grew increasingly restless. Messages from the rear reported that soldiers were sitting down, removing armor, treating this like a rest stop rather than pre-battle positioning. Military discipline was eroding by the hour. Wait until tomorrow, and he'd command a mob, not an army. At 3:45 p.m., Totila assembled his 8,000 cavalry into attack formation. These weren't random warriors, they were the Gothic kingdom's nobility. Count Osbald of Verona, Duke Ragnaris of Pavia, Lord Witiges the Younger, nephew of the previous Gothic king. Every significant Gothic family sent its finest warrior. The formation glittered with gold-inlaid armor, silk banners, and weapons worth fortunes. This was the Gothic elite, the inheritors of the kingdom, the future of Gothic Italy. Totila positioned himself at the formation's tip, the place of greatest honor and highest danger, a king leading from the front, demonstrating courage that would inspire his warriors. He wore armor decorated with purple enamel, the royal color. His helmet bore a golden crest. His horse, a massive gray stallion named Thunderer, wore iron plates that alone weighed more than a full-grown man. At 3:58 p.m., Totila looked back at his 8,000 nobles, raised his sword toward the Roman line, and shouted the war cry that had echoed through Gothic victories for a century. For the kingdom, 3,000 voices answered. 8,000 horses began moving forward, accelerating from walk to trot to canter to full gallop. The charge that would destroy Gothic Italy had begun, and Narses, watching from the Roman center, whispered a single word to his nearest officer. Now, the Gothic cavalry accelerated uphill, their armor glittering in afternoon sun, their war cries echoing off the valley walls. To Roman soldiers who'd never seen Gothic nobility in full charge, it must have looked like the apocalypse made of iron and horses. But Narses had calculated this moment down to the second. As the Goths reached 400 yards bow range, he gave no dramatic speech, no inspiring words, just a simple raised hand. The signal 16,000 archers had been waiting for all day. As the Goths reached bow range, 16,000 archers, 8,000 on each flank, began shooting into their flanks. The first volley struck at 400 yards. 16,000 arrows launched simultaneously, arcing through afternoon air, descending on Gothic cavalry from both sides at 4-5-degree angles. Most arrows missed or glanced off armor. Perhaps 200 found targets, horses screaming as iron points pierced unarmored flanks, riders toppling as arrows slipped through gaps in scale armor. 200 casualties from 8,000. Acceptable losses. The Gothic charge continued, accelerating uphill. At 350 yards, the second volley hit, then the third, then the fourth. Here's where mathematics became slaughter. Byzantine archers weren't firing in coordinated volleys like movie battles. They were shooting continuously, each archer releasing arrows as fast as he could draw, aim, and loose. 6 arrows per minute per archer. 16,000 archers meant 96,000 arrows per minute. 1,600 arrows every single second. Think about what Gothic cavalry experienced riding into that steel rain. Arrows didn't come in waves. They came constantly. A continuous stream from both sides, striking horses and riders without pause. At 300 yards, penetration became lethal. Arrows punched through scale armor into flesh. Horses hit in chest or neck collapsed mid-gallop, throwing riders who were then trampled by warriors behind them. The Gothic formation, tight and organized at 400 yards, began loosening as horses fell and created obstacles. By 250 yards, the charge started falling apart, not from cowardice, from physics. Dead horses blocked lanes. Wounded animals veered left or right, disrupting formation. Riders instinctively pulled away from the heaviest arrow concentration, compressing the formation's center. What had been 8,000 cavalry in organized wedge formation became 6,000 inches, increasingly chaotic mass, still charging, but no longer coordinated. Count Osbad of Verona died at 200 yards, an arrow through his throat just above his gorget. Duke Ragnaris made it to 150 yards before his horse took 3 arrows simultaneously and collapsed. Lord Wittages the Younger, riding in the second rank, watched the first rank disintegrate and kept charging because Gothic honor demanded it. He reached 100 yards. An arrow took him through the eye socket, punching through the back of his skull. At 100 yards, the killing reached its peak intensity. Arrows at this range didn't just penetrate armor, they went through armor and the man behind it. Byzantine composite bows pulled to full draw generated 160 pounds of force. At point-blank range, that was enough to pin a man to his saddle. Gothic nobles, seeing the Roman line just yards away, spurred their dying horses forward in one final desperate push. They never reached the Lombard infantry. At 50 yards, perhaps 2,000 Gothic cavalry remained upright and moving. They crashed into wooden stakes the Romans had planted, overnight ankle breakers for horses, obstacles that turned charging cavalry into stationary targets. Lombard infantry, far from breaking, stepped forward and began methodical spear work, stabbing horses and unhorsed riders with brutal efficiency. At 4:17 p.m., 17 minutes after the charge began, the last Gothic knight fell. 8,000 had charged. Approximately 150 made it back to Gothic lines, most wounded, all without horses. 6,000 Gothic nobles, the leadership of an entire kingdom, lay dead or dying in a corridor 600 yards long, and Totila, watching from behind, realized he'd just killed his nation's future in less time than it takes to say Mass. Let those numbers sink in. 17 minutes. In less time than it takes to boil water for tea, the Gothic kingdom lost its entire aristocratic class, every major family, every experienced military commander below Totila himself, the men who governed cities, commanded garrisons, administered justice, and would have led Gothic Italy for the next generation. Gone, not captured for ransom, not wounded and recoverable, dead in a 600-yard corridor that became the most expensive piece of real estate in European history. Here's what chronicles tried to hide. The slaughter wasn't random chaos. It was industrial efficiency. Byzantine archers worked in rotation. Front-rank shooters fired while rear-rank prepared arrows. When front-rank quivers emptied, they switched positions. Arrow resupply came from pre-positioned ammunition dumps every 20 yards behind the archer line. Narses had calculated that each archer would expend 36 arrows in the critical first 15 minutes. He'd positioned exactly that amount within arm's reach of every shooting position. The Gothic survivors who made it back to their lines told stories that sound like fiction. Count Theodoric of Ravenna watched his 3 sons ride forward in the first rank. All 3 died within sight of each other, struck down by arrows before they'd closed half the distance to Roman lines. Duke Gundobad lost his right arm to an arrow that severed it cleanly at the elbow, somehow survived the ride back, and lived long enough to report that he'd counted 17 arrows embedded in his horse before it finally collapsed. Think about what this meant tactically. Traditional cavalry charges relied on momentum and mass punch through enemy lines, create panic, exploit the breakthrough. Gothic cavalry at Taginae never generated momentum. They started at full gallop, but by 200 yards had slowed to struggling walk as horses died and obstacles multiplied. Mass became a disadvantage. The tighter the formation, the easier the target. Every tactical principle that had made Gothic cavalry dominant for 2 centuries failed simultaneously. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. Roman casualties from the cavalry charged 12 men, not 1,200. 12 individual soldiers. 9 Lombard infantry wounded by Gothic spears in the final desperate seconds before the charge collapsed. 3 Byzantine archers hit by random Gothic arrows fired blindly toward the flanks. 12 Romans wounded. 8,000 Goths dead. That's a casualty ratio of 667 to 1. At 4:18 p.m., silence fell over Taginae Valley. Gothic infantry, 67,000 strong, stood watching from their positions. They just witnessed their nobility fathers, brothers, lords who commanded them slaughtered with such efficiency it didn't seem real. Smoke from extinguished torches drifted across the field where 8,000 horses lay dead or dying. The sound of wounded men screaming filled the air, and the Roman line stood unchanged, unbroken, archers already reloading from ammunition reserves. Narses, still positioned at the Roman center, had not moved, had not drawn his sword, had not issued combat orders beyond hold position. He'd designed a formation, calculated the mathematics, and watched 74 years of logistics expertise translate into 17 minutes of perfect execution. Totila, watching his kingdom's elite destroyed, faced a choice that should have been simple: retreat, regroup, live to fight another day. But 67,000 Gothic infantry stood behind him, expecting him to avenge their lords. His reputation, his authority, his very legitimacy as king demanded he do something, anything. At 4:25 p.m., King Totila made the second worst decision of his life. He would send in the infantry, all of them. 67,000 warriors would surge uphill and overwhelm the Romans through sheer mass. The massacre was about to enter its second phase. The Gothic infantry, watching their cavalry elite slaughtered from afar, erupted in rage. 67,000 warriors surged forward, screaming vengeance, determined to avenge their fallen nobles. They came uphill in a human wave that should have overwhelmed any defense through sheer mass. But Narses had planned for this too. His infantry center, fresh and untouched, locked shields in the Roman testudo formation, while archers continued their methodical killing from the flanks. At 4:30 p.m., the Gothic infantry charge began with a roar that echoed off the valley's mountain walls. 67,000 voices screaming war cries in Gothic, Latin, and a dozen Germanic dialects. They advanced in no particular formation, just mass and fury, climbing uphill over the corpses of their cavalry, determined to reach the Romans who'd killed their lords. The sheer weight of numbers should have been unstoppable. 67,000 against perhaps 8,000 Lombard infantry holding the Roman center. Here's what makes this moment genuinely insane. Gothic infantry were individually brave, well-armed, and motivated by genuine rage. But they had no unified command structure. Their officers lay dead in that 600-yard killing corridor. No tactical plan beyond get uphill and kill Romans. No coordination between units. They were 67,000 individuals who happened to be running in the same direction. The first Gothic warriors reached the Roman stakes at 4:33 p.m. They tried to tear them down, climb over them, squeeze between them. Byzantine archers, having resupplied during the 7-minute pause after the cavalry slaughter, resumed their mechanical killing. But infantry presented different targets than cavalry. Smaller, more dispersed, harder to hit consistently. Arrow effectiveness dropped from the devastating rate against cavalry to perhaps 20% against scattered infantry. 20% of 96,000 arrows per minute still meant 19,200 arrows, finding targets every 60 seconds. Think about that. Gothic warriors climbing uphill, exhausted from the grade, stumbling over dead horses and fallen comrades, taking constant arrow fire from flanks they couldn't defend against. The advance didn't stop. There were too many Goths for arrows alone to halt, but it slowed, became ragged, lost cohesion. At 4:38 p.m., the first Gothic warriors reached the Lombard shield wall. Here's where Roman discipline became the decisive factor. Lombard infantry formed in testudo shields, overlapped front and overhead. Spears protruding through gaps presented no openings. Gothic warriors threw themselves against the formation with suicidal courage. They climbed on top of shields, trying to break through by weight. They grabbed Roman spears and attempted to yank them from formation. Some succeeded in killing individual Lombards, creating gaps. But here's what Gothic infantry couldn't overcome. Roman formations were designed to absorb casualties and automatically close gaps. When a Lombard fell, the men beside him stepped inward, shields locking, spear points filling the space. The testudo didn't break. It flexed, absorbed impact, and held. Gothic warriors who broke through the first rank found themselves isolated, surrounded, cut down by secondary ranks. By 4:45 p.m., Gothic infantry had been attacking for 15 minutes with zero breakthrough success. They'd lost approximately 8,000 men to arrows and spear thrusts. The Lombard line had bent, but not broken, and the Goths, exhausted from climbing uphill in armor, while under constant fire, began losing their rage-fueled momentum. Then Narses sprang the second trap. At 4:46 p.m., he signaled his cavalry wings. 4,000 Herulian horsemen on the left, 3,000 Byzantine cavalry on the right, who'd been held in reserve throughout the entire battle. Fresh horses, fresh warriors positioned on high ground at the Gothic flanks. They charged downhill into the exposed sides of the Gothic infantry mass. What happened in the next 30 minutes would make the cavalry slaughter look merciful by comparison. The Roman cavalry charge hit Gothic flanks at 4:47 p.m. like twin hammers striking an anvil. 7,000 horsemen, Herulian and Byzantine, crashed into Gothic infantry who were facing forward, focused on the Lombard shield wall, completely unprepared for attack from the sides. The impact created instant catastrophe. Gothic warriors on the flanks, pushed inward by cavalry pressure, compressed the center. Men couldn't raise their weapons, couldn't turn to face threats, couldn't even fall when wounded, held upright by the crush of bodies. Here's where discipline became the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. Roman cavalry didn't charge wildly into the Gothic mass. They worked in coordinated waves. First rank charged, struck with lances, withdrew. Second rank immediately followed, striking while Goths were still reeling. Third rank mopped up. Then the first rank, having reformed, charged again. It was systematic, efficient, industrial-scale killing, executed with cavalry instead of archers. Think about what Gothic infantry experienced. Arrows from the front flanks, spears from the Lombard center, cavalry lances from both sides. Nowhere to run, because retreat meant trampling your own comrades. Nowhere to hide, because the valley's walls funneled everyone into the killing zone. Individual Gothic courage became irrelevant when every direction offered only different methods of death. At 4:52 p.m., the Gothic center began to crack. Not from cowardice, from mathematics. You can't maintain fighting formation when you're losing 400 men per minute, and replacements can't reach the front because bodies block the way. Gothic warriors at the front, facing the Lombard testudo, glanced backward for support and saw only chaos. Their comrades weren't forming second ranks. They were dying to cavalry attacks or fleeing from arrow fire. Ancient sources describe a Gothic warrior named Alagern, who embodied both the courage and futility of the infantry assault. He broke through the Lombard shield wall, actually penetrated 3 ranks deep, killing 5 Romans with an axe before secondary ranks surrounded and cut him down. His individual achievement was remarkable. His strategic impact was 0. The line closed behind him. The formation held. His sacrifice changed nothing. By 5 p.m., Gothic cohesion collapsed completely. 67,000 had attacked. Perhaps 45,000 remained combat capable. The rest lay dead, wounded, or too exhausted to fight. Those 45,000 began the transformation from army to mob. Some continued attacking the Roman center with doomed determination. Others tried to fight off the cavalry. Most simply stopped fighting and looked for escape routes. Here's what Gothic chronicles tried to hide. The rout began not from Roman breakthrough, but from Gothic realization. These warriors, watching their cavalry elite slaughtered in 17 minutes, then spending 30 minutes achieving nothing against Roman infantry, suddenly understood they couldn't win. Couldn't even hurt the Romans enough to matter. The psychological collapse preceded the military one. At 5:03 p.m., someone in the Gothic rear ranks history never recorded who shouted the words that ended a kingdom. Fall back. Save yourselves. The shout spread through Gothic lines like fire through dry grass. Fall back became retreat, became run. Within seconds, 45,000 Gothic warriors simultaneously decided that survival mattered more than vengeance. The organized Gothic infantry assault transformed into a panicked rout, and Narses, watching from the Roman center, smiled and gave the order every defeated army dreads, hearing from their enemy. Pursue them, kill them all. The real slaughter was about to begin. By 6 p.m., Gothic cohesion shattered completely. 67,000 became individuals fleeing for survival. Roman cavalry, fresh and uncommitted, until this moment swept from the flanks for pursuit. What followed wasn't battle. It was extermination. Romans hunted Goths through valleys and forests, spearing fleeing men until darkness made killing impossible. Ancient sources claim 45,000 Goths died that day. Even if exaggerated, the Gothic kingdom lost the majority of its fighting men in 6 hours. The pursuit began with calculated efficiency. Narses didn't release all his cavalry at once that would create chaos and reduce killing effectiveness. Instead, he deployed them in waves. First, 4,000 Herulian cavalry swept right, cutting off the northern escape route. Then 3,000 Byzantine horsemen swept left, sealing the southern valley exit. Gothic infantry, fleeing in panic, found themselves channeled into narrowing corridors where Roman cavalry waited like wolves at a sheep pen. Here's what made this pursuit different from typical ancient warfare. Traditional battles ended when armies broke. Winners celebrated, losers fled. Casualties from actual combat rarely exceeded 10%. Narses had studied Gothic wars for 2 decades and understood something crucial. Let enough Goths escape, and they'd rebuild, regroup, fight again in 5 years. End the Gothic kingdom today, and Italy stays Roman forever. He issued orders that shocked even his own commanders. No quarter, no prisoners. Pursue until full dark. Think about the geography. Taginae Valley narrowed as it ran north and south. Gothic infantry running for their lives concentrated in those narrow passages. Roman cavalry didn't need sophisticated tactics, just ride alongside fleeing men and stab downward with lances. A trained cavalryman could kill a running infantryman every 15 seconds. 7,000 Roman cavalry working for 3 hours could theoretically kill 84,000 men. The actual number approached 30,000 before darkness intervened. At 6:20 p.m., Gothic survivors reached the Flaminian Way, the main Roman road running north-south. Some scattered into forests. Others continued along the road, hoping speed would save them. Roman cavalry, familiar with local geography from Narses's obsessive pre-battle reconnaissance, knew exactly where forest paths emerged. They positioned ambush points at every exit. Gothic warriors who thought they'd escaped found Roman lances waiting in clearings. The killing took on an industrial quality that disturbed even Roman chroniclers. Procopius, writing decades later, described cavalry working in shifts. First group killed until horses tired. Second group took over. Third group finished stragglers. No rage, no battle fury, just methodical extermination. Gothic warriors threw down weapons, begged for mercy in Latin, offered surrender. Romans killed them anyway. Narses' orders were absolute. By 7 p.m., the sun began setting. Roman cavalry had pursued Gothic survivors for nearly 2 hours, covering approximately 15 miles from the original battlefield. The entire region between Taginae and the next major town became a hunting ground. Local Italian peasants, emerging from hiding, found bodies every 50 yards along roads and trails, some Gothic wounded, left behind by the pursuit, bled out slowly in ditches and forests. Here's what Gothic survivors reported later. Approximately 12,000 escaped the immediate pursuit by scattering into deep forest or reaching fortified towns before Romans arrived. Of the 77,000 Goths who entered Taginae Valley that morning, perhaps 15,000 survived nightfall, and many of those were wounded, traumatized, or separated from any organized command. 62,000 dead or missing. The Gothic nation had committed suicide attacking Narses' formation. At 8:15 p.m., darkness made further pursuit impossible. Narses ordered his cavalry to return to the battlefield and establish camp. As they rode back, the scale of what they'd accomplished became clear. For miles, bodies lay thick enough to walk on without touching ground. The mathematical impossibility had occurred. 18,000 Romans had destroyed an army of 77,000 inches. 6 hours of fighting. But one man was missing from the body count. King Totila had fled the battlefield on horseback during the rout, surrounded by his personal guard. And as long as the Gothic king lived, the war wasn't finished. Totila fled the battlefield with a handful of guards. Wounded by an arrow that had pierced his armor, he rode north, hoping to reach Gothic strongholds and rebuild. He made it 70 miles before blood loss caught him. In a village whose name history forgot, the last effective Gothic king died in a peasant's bed, the crown that had ruled Italy for 60 years slipping from dead fingers. With Totila went the Gothic dream of an independent kingdom. The arrow had struck Totila during the infantry collapse. At approximately 5:15 p.m., a random Byzantine shaft fired from 300 yards that found the gap between his breastplate and backplate, just below the left shoulder blade. Not immediately fatal, the iron point lodged near his spine, bleeding internally where pressure couldn't stop it. Totila, feeling warmth spread across his back, realized he was dying, but refused to die on the battlefield where his kingdom had just been destroyed. He gathered 17 survivors from his personal guard, all that remained of the 50 elite warriors who'd protected him that morning. They rode north on the Flaminian Way, avoiding Roman cavalry patrols by traveling through forests and fields. Each mile, Totila weakened. By midnight on June 25th, he couldn't sit upright in his saddle. His guards tied him to his horse to prevent him falling. Here's what chronicles don't tell you. Totila knew exactly what his death meant. The Gothic kingdom had no clear succession. His heir, a nephew named Teia, commanded a garrison 300 miles away and had minimal support among surviving nobles. Without Totila's personal authority holding the fragments together, the remaining Gothic strongholds would fracture into competing factions. Roman diplomacy would exploit those divisions. Within months, organized Gothic resistance would collapse. By dawn, on June 26th, Totila's party reached a village called Capre, 70 miles north of Taginae, deep in territory Goths still controlled. Local villagers, seeing their king, barely conscious and soaked in blood, carried him to the headman's house. The best bed they had was straw and rough blankets. The king, who'd ruled from marble palaces in Ravenna, lay dying in a peasant cottage with a dirt floor. Think about the symbolism. Totila had spent 11 years fighting to preserve Gothic Italy. He'd defeated Belisarius, recaptured Rome, united every Gothic faction under his crown. His kingdom had stretched from the Alps to Sicily. Now he died in a nameless village, surrounded by guards who couldn't save him, knowing that everything he'd built would die with him. At approximately 10 a.m. on June 26th, Totila regained consciousness long enough to speak. His guards leaned close to hear final orders. He said 3 words, recorded by Gothic survivors and confirmed by Roman interrogation of captured guards. Make peace quickly. Then he died. No grand last words, no defiant declarations, just pragmatic advice his people would ignore. The 17 guards carried Totila's body north for burial in Gothic territory, hoping to keep his death secret long enough to organize succession. They made it 12 miles before Roman cavalry, following reports of wounded Gothic riders, caught them. The guards fought to defend their dead king's body. All 17 died within minutes. Roman soldiers stripped Totila's corpse for identification. The purple enameled armor, the royal signet ring, the golden crown that had marked Gothic kings since Theodoric the Great founded the kingdom in 493 AD. Narses, receiving Totila's crown on June 27th, examined it carefully. Solid gold inlaid with garnets, inscribed with Gothic runes declaring divine right to rule Italy, worth a fortune as plunder, worth infinitely more as symbol. He ordered it melted down immediately, and the gold distributed as bonuses to his archers, the men who'd actually destroyed the Gothic kingdom. The symbolism was deliberate. Gothic sovereignty literally dissolved into payment for the soldiers who'd ended it. News of Totila's death reached remaining Gothic strongholds by early July. The reaction was exactly what Totila had feared. Instead of uniting behind Teia, Gothic nobles began negotiating separate surrenders to Rome. Some offered to switch sides in exchange for keeping their estates. Others simply abandoned their garrisons and fled north toward Frankish territory. The Gothic kingdom, which had survived Belisarius and 2 decades of Roman invasion, died not from Taginae's slaughter, but from the simple fact that without Totila, no one could hold it together. After Taginae, Gothic resistance crumbled like a wall without mortar. Cities that had resisted Rome for years opened their gates to Narses without a fight. The few remaining Gothic nobles squabbled over succession rather than organizing defense. Within 2 years, Narses controlled all of Italy, with casualties so light they barely register in historical records. One battle, 6 hours on a summer afternoon, had accomplished what Rome's finest generals couldn't achieve in 20 years of brutal warfare. The mathematical reality was staggering. Belisarius had campaigned in Italy for 13 years, 535 to 548, with armies ranging from 7,000 to 30,000 men. He'd won brilliant tactical victories, captured major cities, even taken Ravenna itself. Result: temporary control that evaporated the moment he left. Total Roman casualties during Belisarius's campaigns: approximately 45,000 dead. Territory securely held at campaign's end: essentially zero. Narses campaigned for 2 years, 552 to 554, with 18,000 men. 1 major battle. Total Roman casualties for the entire campaign: approximately 3,000 dead, most from the Alpine crossing and forced marches. Territory securely held at campaign's end. All of Italy, from the Alps to Sicily. The efficiency difference defied belief. Belisarius averaged 3,400 deaths per year to hold nothing. Narses averaged 1,000, 500 deaths per year to conquer everything. Here's what made the post-Taginae conquest so devastating for Gothic morale. Cities didn't surrender because Roman armies threatened them. They surrendered because Gothic leadership had ceased to exist. Every major Gothic commander had died at Taginae. Every experienced military officer, every noble with the authority and resources to organize resistance. The survivors were junior officers, garrison commanders without strategic vision, and nobles more interested in preserving their personal estates than fighting for a kingdom that was already dead. Rome, the ancient capital that had changed hands 7 times during the Gothic War, opened its gates to Narses on July 18th, 552, 23 days after Taginae. The city's Gothic garrison, numbering perhaps 2,000 men, simply walked out and headed north, rather than face the general who'd killed 62,000 of their comrades in one afternoon. Roman citizens who'd endured 2 decades of occupation, siege, and starvation greeted Narses as a liberator. He entered Rome without fighting a single engagement. Ravenna, the Gothic capital, fell in March 554 after a siege that lasted 8 months, not because Gothic defenders fought brilliantly, but because the city's coastal location required naval blockade. When Ravenna finally surrendered, Narses discovered the city's garrison had been negotiating terms for months. They'd simply been waiting for acceptable surrender conditions, not fighting to win. Think about the strategic collapse. In 20 years of warfare before Taginae, Goths had consistently rebuilt armies after defeats, recaptured lost cities, and maintained effective resistance. After Taginae, complete organizational paralysis, the Gothic nation lost not just soldiers, but its ability to function as a military power. Without nobles to command, garrisons to garrison, or leadership to lead, individual Gothic strongholds became isolated targets waiting for Roman attention. By summer 554, only one organized Gothic force remained, Tea's army of approximately 5,000 men in southern Italy. Narses cornered them at Mons Lactarius in October. The battle lasted 2 days. Tea died in combat on the first day. His surviving warriors fought 1 more day from discipline, then surrendered en masse. With Tea's death, organized Gothic resistance ended. 62 years of Gothic rule in Italy finished not with climactic battle, but with exhausted surrender on a mountain whose name means milk. The final accounting was brutal. The Gothic population in Italy before Taginae, approximately 200,000. After the war's end, in 554, perhaps 80,000. The rest, dead from battle, starvation, disease, or flight to other kingdoms. The Gothic language, which had been spoken across Italy, began its terminal decline. Within 2 generations, it would be extinct. Gothic law, Gothic customs, Gothic identity all dissolved into Roman resurgence. But here's the darkest truth. The Italy that Narses saved wasn't worth saving. Narses would govern Italy for 15 years, rebuilding what war had destroyed, reviving trade, restoring law. The old eunuch that Constantinople's elite had mocked became the man who returned Italy to Roman control for the last time in history. But Taginae's victory came with a darker truth. Italy was so devastated by decades of war that it never fully recovered. The population had crashed, infrastructure had collapsed. The Italy that Narses saved was a shadow of what Rome had lost. Yet without Taginae, even that shadow would have vanished into Gothic darkness. The statistics of destruction were almost incomprehensible. Italy's population in 530 before the Gothic War began approximately 5 million. Italy's population in 554, when Narses secured final victory, approximately 2 million. 3 million people, 60% of the peninsula's inhabitants, dead from warfare, starvation, plague, or flight to other regions. Let that sink in. The Gothic War killed more Italians than both world wars combined would kill in the 20th century, proportionally speaking. Economic collapse accompanied demographic catastrophe. Rome, which had housed 1 million people at the height of empire, contained perhaps 30,000 by 554. The aqueducts that had supplied the city lay broken, too expensive to repair, too complex for surviving populations to maintain. Agricultural production had crashed to 20% of pre-war levels. The fertile plains that once fed an empire now supported scattered subsistence farms. Trade networks that had connected Italy to Africa, Spain, and the East had dissolved. Here's what made Narses's governorship remarkable. He didn't try to restore what was lost. He rebuilt what was possible. He focused on securing roads so trade could resume. He imported grain from Egypt to prevent starvation. He established new legal codes that merged Roman law with practical reality. He fortified strategic cities while abandoning indefensible ruins. Narses governed like he'd fought with mathematical precision, focusing resources where they'd achieve maximum effect, accepting losses where recovery was impossible. But the old general faced challenges that military genius couldn't solve. Italy's surviving population was traumatized, impoverished, and deeply suspicious of any authority. Gothic survivors hated Romans for destroying their kingdom. Roman citizens resented Goths for 2 decades of occupation. Both groups blamed Constantinople for the war's devastation. Narses, representing Byzantine authority, became the focus of resentments he couldn't address through tactical brilliance. Think about the bitter irony. Narses had saved Roman Italy with a victory so complete it entered military legend. But the Italy he saved was dying anyway, just slowly from economic collapse and population decline, rather than quickly from Gothic conquest. The aqueducts would never be fully repaired. The population would never recover pre-war levels. The classical Roman civilization that had flourished for centuries was finished, regardless of who governed the ruins. In 5 years after Taginae, political enemies in Constantinople convinced Emperor Justin II that the 9-year-old Narses had outlived his usefulness. They sent a dismissal letter so insulting that legend claims Narses, in response, invited the Lombards to invade Italy. Revenge against the empire that had humiliated him. Whether true or not, the Lombards did invade in 568. Within a generation, they'd conquered most of northern Italy, undoing much of what Narses had secured. Narses died in 573 at age 95, reportedly heartbroken watching Lombards destroy what he'd built. The man who'd achieved the impossible, conquering Italy with 18,000 men in a 2-year campaign that killed only 3,000 Romans, lived to see his life's work partially unravel. His body was returned to Constantinople in a lead coffin. He was buried without imperial honors. The court that had mocked him as an unqualified eunuch now dismissed him as a failed administrator. But history remembers what politics forgot. But here's the truth that survived historical ingratitude. Taginae demonstrated that warfare is mathematics, logistics, and psychology, not just courage and numbers. Narses proved that a 4-year-old bureaucrat with perfect planning could defeat a nation in arms through superior calculation. His crescent formation, his use of converging archer fire, his tactical patience, these innovations influenced military thinking for centuries. The Battle of Taginae remained the gold standard for how smaller forces defeat larger ones through positional advantage and tactical innovation. Medieval commanders studied it. Renaissance military theorists analyzed it. Modern strategists reference it when discussing force multiplication and geometric advantage. Think about what Narses actually accomplished. He took an army 1/4 the size of his enemy's force and destroyed them so completely that their kingdom ceased to exist within 2 years. He did it through planning that started months before the first arrow flew. through logistics that got 18,000 men across impassable mountains, through positioning that turned geography into a weapon, through psychology that made enemies exhaust themselves before fighting began. The crescent formation became a template studied for centuries. How to use converging fields of fire to create killing zones. How to sacrifice apparent strength in one area to create decisive advantage in another. How to make an enemy's numerical superiority irrelevant through geometric arrangement. Modern military terminology still references concepts Narses demonstrated at Taginae. Force multiplier describes how technology or positioning can make smaller forces perform like larger ones, exactly what 16,000 dismounted archers did to 8,000 cavalry. Kill zone describes the space where converging fire creates maximum lethality, exactly what Narses's 4 5-degree archer angles created. Economy of force describes achieving objectives with minimum resources, exactly what Narses' entire campaign embodied. The lessons transcend the specific battle. Lesson 1. Logistics defeats courage. Gothic warriors were individually braver than their Roman counterparts. Didn't matter. Romans had better supply chains, better planning, better calculation of what armies actually need to function. Lesson 2. Geography is a weapon. Narses didn't just fight in Taginae Valley, he weaponized it. The slope, the narrowness, the inability to flank all turned into Roman advantages through positioning. Lesson 3. Psychology precedes combat. The 6-hour wait in June heat-wearing armor, the elaborate Roman drills creating impression of confusion, the deliberate sun positioning, all broke Gothic morale before fighting started. Lesson 4. Innovation beats tradition. Gothic cavalry charges had worked for 2 centuries. Narses designed something specifically to counter them, and Gothic commanders couldn't adapt fast enough. Lesson 5. Perfect execution trumps superior numbers. 67-to-1 casualty ratios don't happen by accident. They happen when one side calculates everything and the other side trusts courage. The archaeological evidence still exists. In the Apennine foothills near modern Gualdo Tadino, farmers plowing fields occasionally unearth iron arrowheads, corroded scale armor, and human bones. The physical evidence of the day: an elderly eunuch destroyed a kingdom through mathematics and made the impossible inevitable. Visitors to the region can still see the valley's shape, still calculate the angles Narses used, still understand why this ground was perfect for slaughter. The geography hasn't changed in 1,472 years. What changed was everything else. A kingdom died, a civilization was saved temporarily, and warfare itself evolved because one 4-year-old accountant proved that wars are won with ledgers before they're won with swords. But let's not romanticize what happened at Taginae. 62,000 human beings died in 6 hours. 62,000 fathers, sons, brothers. 62,000 individual stories, individual futures, individual loves and hopes and fears ended in a valley because 2 empires couldn't coexist. The Gothic kingdom that died at Taginae represented 3 generations of cultural development, Gothic law codes that had merged Germanic traditions with Roman jurisprudence, Gothic architecture that had created new fusion styles, Gothic literature, poetry, and music all lost when the people who created them were slaughtered or dispersed. Think about what extinction means culturally. Within 2 generations of Taginae, no one spoke Gothic as a native language. The customs, the songs, the stories passed down through Gothic families all vanished because there weren't enough Goths left to preserve them. Modern historians estimate that Gothic culture would have developed into something unique, neither fully Germanic nor fully Roman, but a synthesis that might have enriched European civilization. Taginae ensured that synthesis never happened. The Roman perspective celebrates Narses's genius, And legitimately so. His planning was extraordinary, his execution flawless. But from the Gothic perspective, this was genocide disguised as military necessity. 77,000 warriors entered that valley. 15,000 left. That's not victory and defeat, that's cultural annihilation. The Italian peasants, who witnessed the aftermath, described scenes that haunt historical records. Bodies so thick in places that you couldn't see ground. Rivers running red for days downstream from the battlefield. Wolves and crows feeding for weeks on corpses that couldn't be buried fast enough. The smell, a combination of blood, excrement, and decomposition, reportedly made nearby villages uninhabitable for months. Local tradition holds that for years afterward, Italian farmers refused to plant crops in Taginae Valley because the soil was cursed with too much blood. Whether superstition or historical fact, the tradition captures something important. This wasn't just a battle. It was a wound in the land itself. The Gothic survivors who escaped faced futures as bleak as death. Many fled north to Frankish or Burgundian kingdoms, where they lived as impoverished refugees. Others assimilated into Italian populations, abandoning Gothic identity to avoid persecution. Some continued resistance for years in remote mountain strongholds, but without organization or hope, just dying slowly rather than quickly. The women and children left behind in Gothic communities faced horror when Roman forces secured territories. Historical sources delicately mention pacification and reorganization, euphemisms that likely concealed systematic violence against remaining Gothic populations. We don't have detailed records because victors write history, but demographic evidence suggests Gothic civilian populations declined even faster than military losses would predict. And what of Narses himself in his final years? Sources suggest he became increasingly isolated, respected for his achievements, but never loved. Constantinople's court, which had mocked him as an unqualified eunuch, now viewed him with suspicious awe. A man who'd killed an entire nation was frightening even when he worked for you. When political enemies finally convinced Justin II to dismiss him in 567, the 8-9-year-old general reportedly wept, not from humiliation, but from watching everything he'd built begin to collapse. The Lombard invasion that followed proved what Narses had always known. Italy's devastation made it indefensible. He'd saved Roman Italy through perfect military execution, but he'd saved a corpse that was already rotting from within. His death in 573 came as relief, finally free from watching his life's work unravel, while being blamed for disasters others had created through political stupidity. So yes, Taginae was a military masterpiece. Yes, Narses demonstrated genius. Yes, the battle changed history, but it also ended a culture, devastated a peninsula, and proved that sometimes winning completely means losing something irreplaceable. The Gothic kingdom died at Taginae. Gothic culture died in the decades after, and Italy died slowly over the next century, never recovering the prosperity that both Goths and Romans had destroyed fighting over its corpse. That's the full truth that victory celebrations omit. So here we are, 1,472 years after June 552 AD. What does the Battle of Taginae actually mean? What should we remember about a day when 18,000 men destroyed 77,000 through mathematics and geometry? We should remember this. A 4-year-old eunuch who'd never commanded troops in combat defeated the largest Gothic army ever assembled through perfect planning, ruthless logistics, and tactical innovation that changed warfare forever. Narses proved that courage without calculation loses to calculation without courage, that studying supply chains matters more than studying Caesar, that an accountant with perfect preparation defeats a warrior king with imperfect planning. 18,000 Romans faced 77,000 Goths. The mathematics said Rome would lose, The Gothic warriors were brave, well-armed, fighting for their homeland. They had every advantage, except the one that actually mattered. They were charging into a geometry problem they couldn't solve. Call to action. If this story changed how you think about warfare, about preparation versus improvisation, about the power of mathematics over courage, hit that subscribe button, because there are dozens more stories like this. Battles where planning defeated strength. Sieges where logistics determined outcomes. Moments when someone treated war like a math problem and proved that numbers matter more than bravery. Drop a comment. What shocked you most? That Narses was 74 and had never commanded troops? That 8,000 Gothic nobles died in 17 minutes? That the casualty ratio was 667 to 1? That arrows rained at 1,600 per second? That Rome's greatest general failed for 13 years while an accountant succeeded in 2? That an entire kingdom ceased to exist after one afternoon? Share this video with someone who needs to understand that preparation beats improvisation, that logistics wins wars, that sometimes the greatest generals aren't the ones with the most courage, but the ones with the best spreadsheets. Because that's the eternal lesson of Taginae. Warfare isn't about glory, it's about beans, arrows, march rates, and positioning calculated to the foot. Narses didn't inspire his troops with stirring speeches. He didn't lead heroic charges. He measured distances, counted arrows, calculated angles, and designed a formation that turned 18,000 into 180,000 through geometric force multiplication. 77,000 Goths entered Taginae Valley on June 25th, 552 AD. 15,000 left. The Gothic kingdom, which had ruled Italy for 62 years, ceased to exist within 24 months. One battle, 6 hours, and the proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the accountant saves the empire while the warriors watch in awe. Now you know why battles nobody remembers sometimes matter more than the famous ones everyone knows. Why a 4-year-old eunuch belongs in the same conversation as Alexander and Caesar. Why perfect logistics beats imperfect courage. Why mathematics is the deadliest weapon ever invented. I'll see you in the next one, where we'll explore another moment when someone refused to accept impossible odds and changed history through calculation and innovation. Until then, remember Taginae, remember Narses, remember that the greatest warriors sometimes wear accountants' robes instead of armor, and remember that in 552 AD, 16,000 archers firing at calculated angles proved that warfare is geometry, and kingdoms die when they charge into equations they can't solve. The Goths brought courage. Narses brought mathematics. History recorded which one mattered more.